creative process for the classical string quartet was pretty straightforward. I just come up with a melodic idea and I develop the melodic idea. And then I go to the next movement, I come up with a new melodic idea, a new tonality, a new key, a new tempo, and then I create something different. And then I went along for those 5 movements with different keys, different moods. And then when it came to the jazz quartet, I wanted to write variations. So I revisited my string quartet and I took music elements in that string quartet and I reinterpreted the whole thing in a jazz setting. So I changed some moods, I changed some rhythms to make it fit the jazz environment. In classical environment, every single note is written. Every single note, every bowing, every forte, piano is all written. In jazz environment, very little is written and a lot is left for the musicians to interpretation, to improvisation, to listening to each other and come up with some new material on the spot. That's the main difference. I would say also that jazz has a swing element. It has to groove, it has to swing. And the swing element might not be found in the classical environment. The most challenging aspect of the composition was first to write a string quartet. For me was not easy because I'm a jazz musician, so I have to learn how to write in a classical environment, and it took me a while to get used to that mindset. But also, I would say the most challenging was to deconstruct what I just finished. As soon as I finished writing my classical string quartet, I had to deconstruct and find a new way to make it work for a jazz quartet. It's a little bit like if you finish, let's say, a sculpture, you have a definite face of someone, and then you just take it apart and you do another sculpture with the same material. So it's kind of very counterintuitive to destroy what you just finished in order to create something different. I didn't really know what would come out. At some point, when you write music, you don't really know all the outcomes. So it turns out that the jazz is more lively, but I didn't plan it to be this way. I just wrote my jazz variations and I made those guys play it, and then that's how it sounds like. Writing classical music clearly comes from my stay at the Juilliard School. That's when I met my classical music teacher named Kendall Briggs, and I started to delve in that world. I had no idea about it before then. I learned one step at a time. I would write small chorals, and then I would write bigger chorals, and then I would write symphonic pieces, and then I would analyze what other great composers do, and it influences me, like maybe I want to write this kind of piece, maybe I want to write a string quartet, and eventually I start to look at other people's scores, how they do, and then I try to do my own variation of that, my own interpretation. So it's a long process, I would say. I didn't even have an idea that I would do jazz variations. I'm just here at home and I say, I'm going to write a string quartet. Meanwhile, I was also doing jazz gigs. I was doing my life. I'm a jazz bass player. And it's only when it was finished that I decided, hey, there's some things that can work in a jazz environment here. But I didn't plan it to be that way at the very beginning. I picked the Ulysses Quartet because I wanted first a quartet that plays together all the time. I wanted touring quartet. I wanted a band. I didn't want 4 session musicians. And I think they are the best of the best. And I also wanted a string quartet that is very good in the classical world. I was not necessarily looking for a crossover kind of string quartet, people that were used to playing projects with jazz musicians. I wanted a string quartet that is used to playing Beethoven at Carnegie Hall, basically. And that's what I think they have. For the jazz recording, I wanted to match the classical quartet, so we all recorded in the same room, something that is not done very often. But I want to have the room sound, the same. It feels almost like those 2 quartets can play one after the other. And it was tracked by master engineer James Faber, who really knows how to deal with this kind of situation. So I felt confident, and we were all doing without any mistakes, because you cannot fix anything when you're all in the same room. I picked the title The Contrapuntist because I wanted something that ties up the whole project. You have 1 string quartet, 1 jazz quartet. What's the commonality? The commonality is the guy who wrote the music for both pieces, which is the same person. It is the contrapuntist. It's me. It's me who wrote counterpoint for the classical side. It's also me who plays counterpoint when I play bass line on the jazz side. So that ties up the whole project. That's what it was a cool title. For example, in Andante sostenuto, the 5th movement of my string quartet, it's very dramatic. It's the end. It's the intense, and the melody is very strong. But in the jazz variations, that's also the 5th movement. And with jazz musicians, we would rather finish with something a little bit more happy and joyful. So this one has a more funky flavor to it, a more bouncy groove. So they're still the same piece, but in a way they're very different emotionally, not only within the sound of each part. And on the other hand, the movement's called Scherzo 2, and its counterpart jazz, which is Sketch of Scherzo 2, are very similar. It's kind of like, it's a fast movement, it can be a soundtrack for an action movie, and they are more alike. So sometimes my variation would be very different from the original emotionally, and sometimes we're just in the same world, the same intensity and same emotion. I think there's different layers on these recordings. You can just listen because you like both sides, the classical side and the jazz side, and that's it. But as you get closer, it's like, oh, actually this reminds me of this reminds me of that. And you can even create your own playlist with each section and its mirror interpretation, and then you will find even more connections. So it can be listened to as a game, like try to connect the dots, and it can just be listened to as a piece of art or piece of music, and you just enjoy those 2 sides. I enjoyed to have the listener involved like that, because I think it's very much interactive, it's inviting. I think if I was listening to a recording like that, I would want to guess what's going on in this recording. And I believe even if you don't have musical studies, I believe you can sense there's something going on. There's something more than just 5 songs and another 5 songs. I didn't want this music to be labeled jazz or classical. I would call it still a jazz album, even though I'd rather not mix and not put a label. And I think it's just music. And it happens to have been made by a jazz musician, so you might call it this is jazz music, but really, if you just listen to the string quartet, can you tell it's a jazz musician who wrote it? I don't think so. So it's music. I like to break the mold of what my previous album used to sound like, more than breaking the mold of what a jazz album would sound like. It's something that I always do. My first album was a sextet, then I went into a quartet, then I went solo bass, now I bring strings. So I break the mold I'm just coming from. I'm not going to do 2 albums the same way in a row. I expect jazz music to always have a flavor of jazz that sounds like jazz, that swings, that have the instruments that jazz musicians play. And that's the reason why I didn't want to mix those two, the string players with the jazz players, because I feel it waters down. Then the jazz players start to try to play like classical players, and the classical players try to play like jazz players with the drums. No, let's keep them separated. But I still want to bring those 2 worlds together. So that's my idea, that's the vision I had, to make it work without having them play together. They play a piece that is similar, but not the same, and you can bounce back from one world to the other and enjoy 2 sides of the same music. With this album, I would like for you to enjoy the music, enjoy the pieces, enjoy the composition, and enjoy those 2 musical worlds. They are 2 worlds that are part of my personality, and I believe you don't have to belong to one or the other. You can embrace both at once. And you will find out a lot about the dynamics of composition, and I would think that you will learn something about composition.